Minister Rowe.
Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. How dare that minister over there claim the success of state housing areas when after 3 years we see 1,300 houses having been built. Now we have a panic measure to expand that by another 3 years. And that won't help the situation because failure doesn't result from failure. Success won't result from a failure. It'll just be more failure. Mr. Speaker, this government shouldn't be allowed one more day in power when it has made such an unholy mess of housing in New Zealand through its own actions. It is this government's actions that have actually caused the housing crisis, and it's this government's inaction which has failed to remedy them. And Mr. Speaker, in addition to all of that, you have a situation where, as a result of an open-ended immigration policy, which actually does create significant demand, despite denials by the government, it then has to panic to provide more homes when that could be avoided by having a sensible immigration policy and a genuine strategy for building homes in New Zealand. So the housing policy that is claimed, and it's actually claimed to be a comprehensive housing policy, is none of that. It's nothing at all like that. It's getting worse. The effects of it are getting worse through government inaction, and the need for this particular bill is just evidence of that. Now look at the results in Auckland, where people are actually leaving in droves because they can't buy houses there because of the prices, they can't rent there because the rents are too high, and between 2008 and 2013, 32,184 of them left Auckland for Wellington, Waikato, Canterbury and elsewhere, while 3,000 less than that number went there from those areas. So there's actually a drift away from Auckland because of these problems. And the problem is, as Shamabeel Yaqub said, quote, the challenge for a lot of people is they're not able to get the same kinds of jobs or job security in other parts of New Zealand. That's probably why it's only a third of the people saying they've actually considered it. And Mr. Speaker, it's actually worse than that. It's worse than that because, in fact, while 32% of Aucklanders want to move out because of housing pressures, another 36% would also go if they could get adequate employment in the other regions. And that outflow is actually hurting Auckland's economy. And as Alan Johnson of the Salvation Army said, and I quote, there's people leaving Auckland in bigger numbers than ever because of the house prices. It will undermine the city's competitiveness. People doing lower paid jobs, particularly in the service and construction sectors, need to be able to afford to live in the city. Isn't that putting it in a nutshell? So the fundamental problem, as we all know, is that housing in Auckland is actually unaffordable, and worse than that, it is still a runaway problem. And it is all based, the failure to deal with that is all based on this government's neoliberal belief in the market as being a way of solving these problems. They seem to think that blaming local government and providing more liberal planning laws will somehow result in a solution to these problems. And of course it is, as I've said, Mr. Speaker, exacerbated by an open-door immigration policy. And it is caused by ministers, 3 of them in fact, who are simply not on top of their jobs, simply don't know how to do this, don't know how to solve it, and they should all resign. In fact, the whole government should go and let parties into government which can actually deal with these issues.
Yeah.
Now, Mr. Speaker, in the context of such comprehensive policy failure, and that's what it is, New Zealand First will not support this bill. In that context, New Zealand First will not support this bill. And there are 2 reasons. The government is hanging its hat on one primary action, these state housing areas. Now, New Zealand First doesn't have a problem with state housing areas in themselves. We don't disagree with that. That's okay. It's actually consistent with New Zealand First policy. But in fact, it's not enough, because all it does, as I've already indicated, with local government agreement through housing accords, is to define land available for housing, and it does no more than that. And because it does no more than that, it doesn't necessarily actually result in more houses being built. And especially, Mr. Speaker, it doesn't result in more houses that people can afford to buy being built. And therefore, it is a failed policy. And for that reason, because it doesn't go far enough, it doesn't do enough, how could New Zealand First possibly agree to such measures to extend it? Now, Mr. Speaker, after 3 years of failure, and because of the government's failure to actually invest in housing, rather than just provide for these areas, we have a continuation, and we will continue to see a housing crisis, a worsening housing crisis in Auckland. Without actual investment in the purchase of land and the development of land by the government, this problem will never cease, because the market cannot provide what is needed in New Zealand. And that's no surprise. That has actually been the case for a very long time in this country, and it hasn't changed. Why this government thinks it will, I can't possibly imagine. Now, Mr. Speaker, the pathetic 1,300 house result will actually continue. Maybe they'll do a little bit better than 1,300 over the next 3 years, but that's such a drop in the bucket, it doesn't even begin to address the housing crisis, especially in Auckland. Mr. Speaker, New Zealand First housing policy is much better than this, and I can see the minister grinning, but look at him laughing. He should be laughing at himself, because we can see his policy in total failure, and yet he will not listen to anybody else. And the fact is that New Zealand First wants a housing commission to do the strategic planning that this government doesn't even consider needs to be necessary. Secondly, New Zealand First would establish Kiwi housing to buy and develop land on a scale which this government hasn't even considered, to ensure modest homes are built for modest prices, and to allow easy term repayment for people who wish to buy them. Now, the second and unrelated part of the bill is to change the law, not to confirm it or clarify it, as is being claimed, but to change the law to allow the sale of state housing land without offer-back provisions. Now, that is the normal process. Those offer-back provisions are normal process under the Public Works Act, because it protects the rights of people. And, Mr. Speaker, those rights should always be respected and should not be done away with simply because this government is in panic mode over housing in New Zealand. That's not good enough. People's rights are worth more than that. We won't support that provision for that reason alone. But, Mr. Speaker, in addition to that, the fact that the government is looking at this actually demonstrates its failure of strategic planning and implementation. Because if they had looked forward enough, done the planning, had a decent strategy, they would actually have the time to buy and develop land without having to do these shortcuts, without having to compromise people's rights. And I want to point out some of the words which they claim justify this, because on the end of the justification are the words, and I quote, "where the disposal is necessary to achieve the Crown's housing objectives." Well, what are those objectives? They claim it's to build more houses. But this is state housing land, social housing land we're talking about, and that objective of the government is actually the sell-offs of state houses in the absence of a genuine and comprehensive program for the building of more state houses. And it's also their objective, to fob off state housing to community organisations, many of which are actually not capable of doing that job, simply so that this government can minimise its involvement in social housing. So for all of these reasons, Mr. Speaker, there's no possible way that New Zealand First will vote for this bill.
Speaker.
Dr. Parmjit.